Exercise 12.7. 12.7 is an interesting exercise because it gives you an example of an increasing cost industry. It also provides you with an example of how to compute a Ricardian rent. And this is different from exercise 12.4, which has a constant cost industry. So the situation is as follows. We have a perfectly competitive videotape copying industry, admittedly a very old-fashioned industry, which is composed of many firms that can each copy 5 tapes per day at an average cost of $10 per tape. And in addition to the cost of $10, each firm must also pay a royalty to the film studios who own the copyrights, and the per film royalty rate is an increasing function of total industry output. And this is what makes this industry an increasing cost industry, because the royalty rate is a cost to the videotaping copying firms. And the demand for videotapes is given by 1000 minus 50p. And then the first question asks you that given that the industry is in a long run equilibrium, what will be the equilibrium price and quantity, how many tape firms will there be, and what will be the per film royalty rate. So let's solve that one. Average cost is 10 per tape. On top of that, a royalty rate needs to be paid, and we have the situation where each firm can only copy 5 tapes. So that's not a lot. So the average variable cost to the videotaping firms is 10 plus the royalty rate of 0.002 times Q. And you can see that the average cost indeed is a function now of the total industry output. So in a long run equilibrium, where videotaping firms can easily enter and exit the market, in the long run, price will be equal to the average variable cost. So we have that in the long run, the inverse supply function in this industry will be equal to 10 plus 0.02 times Q. That's the long run equilibrium, and then we can solve for the quantity. So we solve for Q in this regard. So we multiply everything with 500 and we get 500p. Bring this to the left hand side, 10 times 500 is 5000, and the industry supply function is identical to 500p minus 5000. So once you're at this point, and it's important to get this first step in order to arrive at this point, once you are here, it becomes a simple exercise because the long run equilibrium is the point where supply equals demand. So we can now equate the supply and the demand function, and we arrive at an equilibrium price of 11, a total quantity supplied of 500. The royalty rate that needs to be paid is equal to 1, and that is for each copy that is made. And the total number of firms, well, given that each firm can only make 5 copies, the total number of firms is then 500 divided by 5 is equal to 100. And that completes exercise A. And we can continue with exercise question B. Suppose that the demand for copied tapes increases. So they're hard to imagine, but there is an uptick in the demand for videotapes. And the new demand function is identical to 1600 minus 50p. And then the question is, okay, in this new situation, what is the long run equilibrium price and quantity, and how many tape firms will there be, and what is the per film royalty rate? That sounds a little bit boring because you need to do the same thing as in question A, but it's also instructive because now by comparing your answers to question A and B, you can see who actually gains in this industry. Are these the videotape copying firms? Do they gain? Or are these the film studios that own the copyrights? And already to tell you the answer, it are not the videotaping firms, because they are in a perfectly competitive industry. So in the long run, all their profits are competed away by the entry of additional videotaping firms, and their long run profit will continue to be equal to 0. So what will happen? Again, also in the new long run equilibrium, supply needs to equal the demand, and we will observe that the new equilibrium price is equal to 12. The quantity supplied is equal to 1000. The per film royalty rate increases to 2, and the number of active firms increases to 200. So this is because this is a long run equilibrium and entry is possible. And in question C, you then have to graph the long run equilibria, and you need to compute the change in producer surplus. Okay, so let's do that. Here we have a graph with the quantity on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. We have the supply function, and the supply function is equal to this line over here, and then we have the demand function we just get from this equation over here, and we have an equilibrium outcome where the quantity supplied is 500 and the price is equal to 11, and this is the situation of question A. And in question B, what happens is that there's a shift in demand, so demand increases to QD prime, and we get a new equilibrium, and in the new equilibrium the quantity supplied doubles to 1000, and the new equilibrium price is equal to 12. And then you can see that these are the long run equilibria, and there's a change in producer surplus which is equal to the area over here. So it runs from vertically, price increases from 11 to 12, and then there's also change in the quantity supplied. So it's this area over here, which is the change in producer surplus, and we can compute it by taking the integral over the supply function when we increase price from 11 to 12. So the price change determines the range over which we take the integral. Then we plug in the equation that we have for the supply function, which is the one that we already observed over here. We take the integral, and we observe that the increase in producer surplus is equal to 750. And then the question is, okay, who benefits? Does this increase in producer surplus go to the videotape copying industry or to the film studios? And that leads to question D, because suppose that show that the increase in producer surplus is precisely equal to the increase in rents as the quantity expands incrementally from the level in part B to its level in part C. So, and I put it here, rents in yellow. The box says royalty, the increase in royalties, but actually the royalties are different. Those are the total revenues to the film studios, and the rents are the gain. So what they receive on top of that, what they actually want to have for these copying rights. So that's the difference, and I will return to that. So this is not the supply of the videotapes, but this is the supply of the copyrights. So the inverse supply of the per film royalty is given by this equation over here. So the supply is equal to Q is 500 times R, which means that this is the royalty rate that the film studios receive. If this rate is equal to 0, so no royalties are paid, then the film studios will not provide any copying rights. But the higher the price that they receive, the more rights that they are willing to distribute. So when the royalty rate is 2 per movie, then the film studio said, well, then we are fine if you copy up to 100 or 1000 copies of the movie. So that's the supply function of copying rights. So when the royalty rate is 1, film studios offer the right to copy 500 movies, and when the royalty rate is 2, then they allow the videotaping industry to copy up to 1000 movies. And here you can see that the increase in royalties, if we move from a royalty rate of 1 to 2, originally the royalty rate is this square over here, so the total royalties are 1 times 500 is 500. In a new situation, the royalties amount to 2 times 1000, 2000, and the difference is 1500. But we're not interested in the change in royalties, but we're interested in the change in rent. And the change in rent is identical to this area over here. So if the royalty rate moves from 1 to 2, then the increase in surplus in rent to the film studios is identical to this area over here. So now we can compute this change in producer surplus to the film studios by taking the integral over the increase in royalty rate from 1 to 2, and then plugging in the supply function of the film studios, which is identical to 500R, taking the integral and then computing it over the range 1 to 2, we get 1000 minus 250 is 750. And of course, and this is the integral. You can also easily see it from the picture because we have a square over here. The area of the square is 1 times 500, and then we have a triangle over here, and the area of this triangle is 1/2 times 1 times 500 is 250, and the sum of the two is 750. So this is the change in the surplus in the market for copying rights, and we call this the Ricardian rent. So it's the producer surplus that flows to the owners, the suppliers of the scarce inputs. And in this case, the scarce input are not the videotapes, but the scarce inputs are the rights to make copies. And if this market would not exist for videotapes, as it is nowadays, then the owners of the copying rights would not earn anything. Okay, so then question E. The government steps in and it imposes a $5.50 per film tax on the film copying industry. And assuming that the demand for copied films is given like originally in part A, how will this tax affect the market equilibrium? And to foreshadow a little bit of the results, we know that the videotaping industry is perfectly competitive. They don't make a profit. So something will happen to the prices and something will happen to the rents of the owners of the copying rights. So with the tax, we create a wedge between the price that the suppliers get and the price that the consumers will pay. So consumers pay more, 5.5 more than the suppliers will receive. So we can rewrite it like this. We have a supply function which is a function of the price that the suppliers receive. We equate it, so we replace the PS with the expression that we have over here, and then we have an expression in terms of the price that the consumers pay, and we can equate this one to the demand function. And we have one unknown, which is the PD. And when we equated the two, so this is the supply function expressed as a function of the price that the users pay, and we equate this one to the demand function. and the demand function is by definition a function of the price that the demanders will pay. And we can solve for PD, and we get that the new price that the consumers will pay is 16. The suppliers, they get $5.50 less. That's because of the tax. And total demand at this price will be equal to 250. Well, if only 250 copies are sold, it means that the per film royalty rate will be equal to $0.50. And the total tax revenue is equal to 250 copies times $5.50 each is $1,375. And that's question E. Then we can continue with question F. So who will suffer from the tax? How will the burden of the tax be allocated between the consumers and producers? And what will be the loss of the consumer and producer surplus? Well, in the old situation, the price is equal to 11. And in the new situation, the price is equal to 16. So for each copy that the users still buy, so 250, they now pay $5 extra. So the difference is 1,250, the additional expenses by consumers. And the producers, they received 11 in the old equilibrium. Now they receive 1050, so they pay in total 125. And in the old situation, the consumer surplus was equal to 2,500. In the new situation, it's equal to 625. So the loss in consumer surplus is equal to 1,875. And then the producers, under the old situation, the producer surplus was equal to 250. We computed that before. In the new situation, it's identical to 62.5. So the loss in producer surplus is equal to 187.5. And this is the one to keep in mind, because in G we need to have to show that the loss in producer surplus as a result of the tax is not borne by the videotaping firms, but is borne by the film studios, and explain your result intuitively. So here again, I put up the supply function for the copying rights. So again, this is not the final consumer market for the videotapes, but this is for the copying rights, where the price that the film studios receive is the R, the royalty rate, and the quantity that they supply is a function of the royalty rate that they receive. In the original case, the royalty rate was equal to 1, and they supplied 500 copyrights. In the new situation, in equilibrium, 250 copies are sold, and the royalty rate that they receive is equal to $0.50. So they experience a loss of rents, and the loss of rents is identical to this area over here. So again, you can just, because these are all straight lines and this area is a combination of a square and a triangle, you can easily compute the size of this area. You can also do it in the fancy way, taking the integral here, realizing that now the price goes down from 1 to 0.5. So we have a negative change in the rents, and we take the integral over the supply function over this range, and taking the integral we arrive exactly at the 1 minus 187.5. Conclusion, the total loss in producer surplus does not fall on the videotaping firms, but it's paid by the film studios. And the reason is that, to start out with, the videotaping firms, they have no market power, so they earn profits of zero in the long run, and they continue to earn profits of zero. And the film studios are the ones that earn the surplus, and they also are the ones that suffer if a tax gets imposed. And that brings us to the end of exercise 12.7.